Hello, and welcome to this next edition of our series, SRA for HR, where we aim to highlight and demystify some of the SRA rules for the benefit of HR professionals in law firms to really make them accessible and practical and just help you to absorb them as part of your normal day-to-day role. And I'm delighted to be joined today by one of our expert SRA partners, Andrew Pavlovic. Andrew, hi.
Morning.
So our focus today is very much on the SRA and the regulatory aspects of investigations within law firms and involving lawyers. There's a whole world of information out there about investigations more generally, including, our own firm. We've produced a lot of information and video content on partner investigations, the specific constitutional issues around that. Today, it's just about the regulatory piece. So, Andrew, can I just ask you, why are the SRA so interested in internal investigations? And why is it relevant for HR professionals to understand how they'll approach them?
Well, this ties back to our discussion last time, really, regarding unfair treatment, bullying, sexual misconduct, and harassment. And we spoke in that session about the obligation firms have to challenge behaviour that doesn't meet that standard. Well, one obvious way to challenge the behaviour is to investigate allegations when they're received and, if substantiated, take disciplinary action. And firms also have the obligation, which we discussed, to encourage equality, diversity and inclusion. And that includes investigating complaints which are relevant to that principle and ensuring that they are dealt with. Firms that fail to investigate those or do a bad job in investigating them can then create a situation where they're potentially inhibiting people from coming forward. Because if you make a complaint, you see it being dealt with badly or it doesn't ever come to fruition, the next time something happens, you might not be willing to do the same thing. Or a colleague who sees that experience might think, well, there's no point in me complaining either. And what that can do is that can foster a culture of that sort of toxic working environment that we spoke about in the last session as well.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of create a culture where no one feels that they're able to complain or raise issues, or that there'd be any point in them doing so. And if you had a culture like that, and it took a long time for issues to emerge, maybe about a particular individual, because there had been a sort of a culture of silence with no one feeling that they could stand up and complain, the SRA would take that seriously, and they would consider that the firm had failed to meet its objectives in sort of tackling sort of counter-inclusive misconduct.
Okay, so you've talked there about sort of potential consequences for the firm. Specifically for HR professionals who are involved in these investigations, either themselves or assisting, I guess, what are the potential consequences for them if an investigation isn't carried out at all or is carried out inadequately?
Yeah, well, to the extent that a HR professional is implicated in that, either they were aware of things and didn't investigate, or they were part of an investigation that wasn't carried out adequately, then there could be personal action taken against them by the SRA. And there is a relatively high-profile case relating to internal investigations that went all the way to the Solicitor's Disciplinary Tribunal, and the HR director was one of the respondents in that case. He was acquitted, as were the firm, and it was ultimately found that the fair investigation did take place, despite efforts by the senior partner that was being investigated to try and manipulate it. So the firm, the HR director, they were acquitted, but clearly you don't want to be in that position where you're in that situation in the first place. And if it was to go against you in that situation, probably the most likely outcome would be a fine. But clearly, as I say, that's not a place you want to be.
No, and I would say, as you've identified, it is rare. It is rare, but it's just sort of for the HR professional in the law firm getting ahead, making sure that they're protecting themselves, protecting their colleagues, and protecting the firm, as well as the participants in the process. And as you say, making sure that there's independence. So one of the key issues that comes up is around whether or not to have an internal or an external investigator. There's lots of airtime dedicated to that, but I'm specifically interested from a regulatory perspective. What are the aspects, particularly, for example, the HR professional is either it's either asked to be the investigator. That happens less frequently in law firms, but it does occasionally happen for perceived lower level allegations, or if they are supporting the investigation, the investigator. So I guess what are the regulatory aspects around that HR need to know about?
Yeah, well, you already mentioned independence, and obviously that is a key consideration because that is one of the SRA principles, to act with independence and to not put yourself in a position where your own interests conflict with those of another. So that is really the key consideration when you're looking at internal investigations. Can I act independently, or do I have a relationship with someone, which means that that's not possible? And typically that will be, do I have a relationship with the person that's being investigated? But it could also be whether you have a relationship with a witness or a third party, or even the complainant. And the general rule of thumb is that the more senior and prominent a person is in an organisation, the less likely it is that an internal investigation is going to be appropriate. There might be some workarounds, if you've got a different office, or, people that someone who's new, or someone who can say, I don't have a relationship. But generally, I would say that is the general rule of thumb. And you're going to have to explain, if you do an internal investigation, and document why you considered that was appropriate if it was someone more senior. And as I say, there may be reasons or exceptional reasons why that is the case. But if you were going to do that, I would suggest that you set out at the outset why you considered that was an appropriate choice, an appropriate route to take.
Okay, great. So that's really sort of practical handling, sort of a reasoned decision, and document it. We have tried in this series so far to highlight maybe like one document that's really helpful for HR professionals to read, a bit of bedtime reading. And one that you're recommending is the SRA guidance on internal investigations, which I went back and read. I mean, I've read it in the past, just to reassure you, but it's actually a really good read. It's really, really interesting and super practical. And it gives really good, quite detailed guidance as to the sort of things that you should be thinking about when you're conducting an investigation, including that has SRA regulatory implications. So definitely one to recommend to our HR viewers. It specifically talks in that, amongst other things, about self-reporting in this sort of situation. And can we just touch briefly on the issue of self-reporting and the timing of that?
So the test is to promptly report facts or matters which give rise to a reasonable belief that there's been a serious breach of the regulatory arrangements, which is quite a mouthful. But the main sort of things you're looking at there is how do I have a reasonable belief? So that's not actually a very high threshold. Mm-hmm. And the SRA guidance on reporting says that we don't expect firms to just sort of blurt and blindly pass on concerns to the SRA and sort of say, oh, this has happened, and we're just throwing our hands up in the air. They expect firms to assess information, make a considered decision, do I have a reasonable belief, and then report. So they do say that, firms are able to do a sort of a mini investigation to establish whether that reasonable belief threshold has been met. Mm-hmm. But once it has been met, the report needs to be made promptly. And in a typical scenario, you might assess the initial information, say an allegation of misconduct at a work event. You might assess that and say, okay, well, were the people there? Is it possible that this happened? You might have decided, okay, this does need to be investigated. You might have said, we think it may need to be investigated externally because of the factors. And then once you've lined all that up, then that would probably be the appropriate point at which you would contact the SRA and say, this is the allegation, this is what we're doing to investigate, and we'll update you once our investigation is concluded. And most of the time, if you do it that way, and you give the SRA the confidence that you've assessed what you need to do and you're doing it, appropriately, they will say, okay, come back to us when your investigation is complete. And that's what you're looking for, because obviously you don't really want to have concurrent investigations going on with you looking at you doing your investigation and the SRA also asking questions at the same time. You want to sort of take it sequentially as possible.
So once the internal investigation's been concluded and the facts have been established, the firm's maybe looking at, is a disciplinary procedure and disciplinary sanctions in due course warranted? I guess what again are the regulatory aspects to take into account in making decisions about appropriate disciplinary outcomes in the circumstances? Will the SRA have particular expectations as to what a firm will do and what outcome they will reach in particular matters?
Yeah, so the workplace environment guidance that we spoke about in our last session says that it's not enough for firms just to have policies. They need to take disciplinary action where it is appropriate. And what you would be looking at, I think, predominantly from a regulatory perspective, is what is the risk that's represented by this behaviour? And would it be an ongoing risk if it wasn't addressed? And from an SRA perspective, they do not sort of mandate particular outcomes. Clearly, if you know SRA or SDT decisions and you can see what people have been struck off for doing, then that might be a sort of an indication as to the sort of standards that they expect. But in other cases where maybe it's more nuanced or less serious, the SRA are not going to say you need to take this action for this offence. But you do need to be able to justify your decision. And crucially, I think if you are going to take a step short of expulsion or dismissal, you need to be able to establish what you're doing to ensure that that individual isn't going to repeat the same behaviour. So are they going to be sent on a training course? Are they going to be required to sort of have ongoing supervision, or is there going to be any rules around alcohol consumption at work events? All of those things. If you put those in place and you can explain your decision if you're ever asked to, the SRA is not going to say you should have sacked that person or you should have expelled that person. If you make a wrong decision and that person goes on to repeat that behaviour, then providing that you've set out all the things and you've done all the things you should, then again, the SRA shouldn't be coming at you again for making that decision. So it's really just being able to justify why you took the action you did and why you felt that that particular sanction was warranted.
And documenting it.
And documenting it, yeah. And that would usually be documented, say, for example, in a final written warning letter, what the conditions were, for example.
And once the process is completed, then what, if anything, needs to be said to the SRA? What's the follow-up with the SRA?
So if you put in your interim report and the SRA have said, yes, come back to us when you've finished, you then obviously need to go back to them and say that we've completed our process, either we've completed our investigation and we haven't found any evidence to substantiate allegations, or we have completed our investigation, we have found evidence and we've taken X, Y, and Z action. And again, it would be usual to set out in that report any learning points that the firm has identified during the process. And so occasionally there might not be any, but quite often there are. You might be able to say, we've identified a slight gap in our policies, which we've addressed, we're tightening that up, or we're amending it, or we've identified a gap in our training. And to put that into your report to the SRA, so the SRA can say, okay, they've done their investigation, they've investigated properly, they've reflected as a firm as to whether anything can be done to sort of put them in a better position if that were to happen again. And then they're purely just considering, okay, well, do we need to take action now in relation to the individual that was the subject of the investigation, and not spend any time looking at the firm? That would be the ideal outcome from a firm perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have seen that happen. And these are follow-up actions that HR are very much going to be thinking about and are going to be actively involved in implementing. Again, it's really important for HR to be part of those considerations about remediation, about, plugging any gaps, ensuring training's done, updating policies all up in a really joined up way. Again, it comes back to the idea of, HR have to be involved front and center in all of this, hand in glove with the CULP, the compliance team, and, internal or external advisors, really important. So the firm, HR, they've taken the internal processes to the appropriate conclusion. SRA have been notified of the outcomes. What can we then expect from the SRA? What are they doing? What are their follow-up actions after that?
And so the SRA will then obviously assess the information and decide whether or not they need to investigate. And they do say in the internal investigations guidance that you referred to that if they're working from a well-reasoned and good report, then that makes their job easier. They don't have to start from scratch or consider, oh, well, you didn't ask this person that question, so we need to do that, or we need to go down a completely different line of inquiry which the firm missed. So if you've done your job properly, you've made their job easier. But even if you've done that a really good job, they are still going to have to a certain extent, repeat the process because they need to then speak to the complainant, the witnesses, to see whether they would be willing to cooperate or provide witness evidence for the purposes of an SRA investigation. And obviously, people may or may not choose to do that, and quite often they choose not to, and that's the end of the matter.
So let's just be clear about that. We have seen circumstances where the SRA follows up and key people, person A or key witnesses do not want to participate, and the SRA says
that they can't take it further because obviously they wouldn't be able to prove the case to the required standard if the complainant, predominantly the complainant, isn't willing to give evidence, because the evidence couldn't be tested, and they couldn't just take action on the basis of what the firm had done or the firm's report, the firm's conclusion.
Okay.
So we do see that quite regularly because it is a stressful process, particularly if you've just gone through your own internal investigation, which can still be stressful and difficult. And then if you're asked at the end of that process by the SRA, would you be willing to give evidence in a tribunal, even though they do quite a good job in trying to reassure people that anonymity will be preserved and will support you, etc. A lot of the times people actually say thank you, but no thank you. But if they do want to cooperate, then you could be in for quite a long haul, because
briefly, what does that look? Just give us a really high level overview of what that process would look like.
Yeah, so that would be effectively the SRA collecting witness evidence from the individuals, and a back and forwards, and getting evidence, speaking to them, drafting statements, and going through all of that process. And I'd imagine HR's role there really would be to provide well-being and support for people that are involved in that, because, as I mentioned, it can be stressful, and it can take quite a long time. The average SRA investigation, according to their own website, is 12 months. But when they're involved in sort of collating evidence from a number of witnesses, it's quite often closer to maybe 18 months or even 2 years.
Gosh.
So, it's a long haul, and it can be a difficult period for people that are in the midst of that. So I'd imagine HR will play an important role in that period as well, in supporting those individuals. And if at the end, the SRA decide that they can deal with the matter under their own powers, they might issue a sanction, or if they think that it's more serious than that, they would obviously refer the matter to the disciplinary tribunal, and that would start off a completely different process.
And I think perhaps we're going to come back to the SDT and just what that looks like in practice, just as a sort of a helpful overview for anyone who just needs to be aware of that. So we'll do that in another episode, I think. Have you got any sort of just final wrap-up tips for our HR friends, who might have, a lot of people will have dealt with this sort of internal investigation now, but whether they have or they haven't, what are the, I guess maybe just 2 or 3 really significant things that they can do to help themselves and to help the firm and to help the other people involved in the investigation, specifically from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, I think we've mentioned the main one of them already, which is just the documenting of key decisions. So, who's investigating, why are they investigating, why are they appropriate? If the outcome is one that is short of dismissal, why was that an appropriate outcome, and what are you going to do from a regulatory perspective to ensure that behaviour isn't repeated? And from the reporting perspective, as I've already mentioned, putting in things that give the SRA confidence that you have reflected as a firm or as a HR team or the risk compliance team, whatever it is, and you've looked at it and said, okay, maybe there are some gaps here that we could fill, or things that we could do better, to give the SRA confidence that you're on the ball, and that this hopefully is just a one-off event.
Amazing. Well, hey, look, I know we've covered kind of a lot at a very, very high level, but that's been really interesting and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Andrew.
No
Um,
problem.
and I hope you've been able to stay with us to the end. If you have, then thank you so much. If you have any questions, please do feel free to get in touch with Andrew or myself. And thank you again. Hope you've enjoyed it and hopefully see you again soon for the next episode of SRA for HR. Take care. Thanks. Bye.